We are the Audible Editors, and we came together today to talk about a memoir that stole all of our hearts. Every once in a while, there's a book that bubbles up in our conversations. One person will listen to it, and then soon everyone in the office will be talking about it. The one we're talking about today is Small Fry by Lisa Brennan-Jobs, and the incredible thing about this story is how, even though she's the daughter of a very famous person, which we'll get to in a second, she really owns her own narrative in this book. And it's so important and so healing to be able to do that when you're part of a bigger, famous story, to be able to really take that story back for yourself. And so Lisa Brennan-Jobs is the daughter of Chrisanne Brennan and Steve Jobs. And it's a very interesting childhood. Steve and Chrisanne were high school sweethearts, and then Chrisanne became pregnant with Lisa. By the time she was born, the couple had broken up, and Steve Jobs denied paternity. But even though the details of this story are very painful, she just remembers it in this memoir in such a insightful, non-judgmental, moving way that I think spoke to each of us in a really different way.
I think it's one of the best memoirs of the year so far, here in October. The fact that Lisa Brennan-Jobs dives into her own personal story matrix, talking about owning her narrative, I thought was admirable. I admired it. Overall, it is so satisfying because I think she gives herself her due and her story her due, and I emerged with a feeling of sympathy for everyone in that family and rooting for them singly and together. I'm happy that they're a family, and I thought it was just a very satisfying read. The narrative that she owned really worked for me. I've never met my biological father, so I read from the moment I started reading the book, which I did in previews, and then when I could get my hands on it, I read it through the lens of having half of oneself be completely unknown. So how do you know what's you, and how do you know what's that thing that you don't know? Once she committed to finding out and being a part of this family and having a relationship with Steve Jobs, she no longer had the option to pick and choose. And so that was its own kind of courage that I saw manifest in the book. I think what she got was the ability to receive the love that her father had for her. Yeah. That moment where he blesses her telling the story, and also to almost be a spokesperson, not just for herself as a person with no father, but for him. Let's not forget that he was abandoned, and while that doesn't come up in the book, he was given up for adoption, didn't know his own father. I think she really was able to get her hands around something that was a gift for, him and for her and for all of us who don't know everything about our genes, and say, here's something real, and here's something that belongs to everyone.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that she did get what she needed.
Yeah.
Good, go Lisa Brennan-Jobs.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you bring up Steve Jobs being adopted and how that plays into it, because I was also adopted. So I sympathize with Steve Jobs and in that, and how it may have affected his behavior in his life, because I'm also a huge fan of the Isaacson biography. And that is brought up a lot, his adoption and how it affected him in his life. So it was interesting having that perspective on this story, and although I do sympathize with him and have sympathized with him, seeing how his behavior affected the other people in his life was what really struck me.
Yeah, it's hard. He comes across as a very unsympathetic character in this narrative, but at the same time, it's possible to see the sympathy that she has for him, and that a reader can also have for him through experiences like the one you described.
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit of the other side of the coin, where I also love the Isaacson biography, and I was not a fan of Steve Jobs coming out of reading that, and I think this memoir solidified a little bit of that for me. I hadn't thought about it from the perspective of there's still a family and there's still love to be had there, and it's kind of something that unless you're involved with it, maybe you shouldn't judge it quite as much. But his relationship with her and his relationship with her mother was really what struck me. I mean, you have somebody who created this, was at the time the most valuable company in the world, and he has a lot of fame and prestige and people respect him for his intellectual gifts, but that doesn't mean that he was a good person. And I think I'm a big history fan. We tend to look at famous people throughout history and through like rose-colored glasses, and I think that's what really is laid bare here is that doesn't mean that these are good people, and they often are not good people, and it's kind of we don't really have any giants in our life. These people are flawed. And they affect their families in negative ways, and they affect their own legacy in negative ways through that.
And there's definitely a genre of the family tell-all, the family celebrity tell-all, but I think what struck many of us about this memoir is that even though it reveals a lot about Steve Jobs, it's not done in what she regards as a salacious way. It's so deeply thought, deeply felt. It's just such an intimate look at really her story, and Steve Jobs is just a tangential part of that.
Yeah, for me, it's funny. I was saying this, the title Small Fry, the cover itself, nothing looking at it, unless you know that Brennan-Jobs is a hyphenate of one of the most famous names in the world, says this is a book about Steve Jobs or his legacy. And even, I didn't pick it up because of any super worship of Steve Jobs or what he's done. But in listening to it, or I would say, in listening to it, I often forget that it's about him. To me, he's almost like a tertiary character in it because I'm so immersed in the story of Lisa herself and her mother and the friends of the family and what it's like for her going to school. And those are the things that I relate to. And so obviously I'm listening to it from not necessarily a selfish place, but a self-referential place, and how I can relate to that as someone who was raised by a single mother around the same time, West Coast, the salads they eat, like all that stuff really brings me to that time and place that's familiar to me and makes me feel less alone, like that experience she had. Granted, my dad is not Steve Jobs, but the struggles she had and the weird, like awkward moments that she had in life were familiar to me, and that's what I often have to stop myself and go, oh yeah, her dad is Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
So I love that she told this story in a very deliberately, seemingly not salacious, like you said, not tell-all. This isn't like, ooh, I have the real story. It's, I have a story to tell, and you've not heard it, and I want to tell it because I haven't been able to.
Yeah. And being on this like West Coast kind of artistic milieu, I imagine some of that resonated with you too.
Oh yeah, I mean it's everywhere. I mean, like I said, the salads they eat in these big bowls, and that's dinner, and like, living in this expansive land, and it's all about the trees, and that's why they bought the house, not because of how the house looked, but because of the trees. I mean, that's such a West Coast, or Northern California on up. I'm from the Pacific Northwest, but it's a similar kind of vibe of hippies and communing with nature.
Yeah,
so.
And she really, there's a deep love you can tell of California and that lifestyle, and that's something that she and her dad share.
True, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. She talks a lot about the palm trees at Stanford, and they used to go skate there, and how he used to tell her, like, oh, you don't need to go to college, like, those are your most creative years, and people are trying to tell you how to think, and like, that obviously sunk with her, but then she also had the wherewithal at like 9 years old to be like, well, then why do you like to come hang out here so much? Why do you like to come hang out on the Stanford campus? That, yes, it is beautiful, and that might be the reason why, but it's this like interesting relationship between them where he's obsessed with this place and kind of the environment that surrounds them, but is very conflicting in kind of how he's presenting it to her and presenting life to her.
Yeah, but it was something they could connect on.
Yeah.
I find it really interesting that things that I relate to in this book are less about Lisa than about her mother. So, as a single mother, the fact that her mother put up with so many egregious things on their relationship and in growing up, all in order for her to keep a relationship with her father, it's mind-blowing to me, honestly. As someone who's tried to do that, I think the way that Lisa's addressed her mother and is very clear-eyed and still very loving. And I think a lot of us parents are always wondering how our kids are going to remember us and all of our actions. And I think it feels very touching and life-affirming that someone can grow up out of a situation that was so fraught and so unique and yet very common. You know, that it resonates for a reason. There's a number of us are growing up with parents who are emotionally distant in some way or another. They don't have Porsches we can ask for, but they do have different ways of withholding love and different ways of inflicting pain while still trying to show love. And I think she's done such a great job of showing just how that happens, you know, and like I said, like you all have said, her ability to do it without being dishy, I think is what really sells it. You know, you're getting her story that's connected to this really powerful, famous man. I left with less of a love for him than I had before, but I did have empathy, and I didn't expect to come away from that. So that was a really interesting takeaway. But the other way I resonated was as someone who's writing a memoir, to watch someone who's so good at looking back at details from her childhood and tying in the emotions. It's
one of those things with memoirs, you wonder, like, does she have pictures she's referring back to? Because one thing that really struck me was like how she talked about her dad's hands and the hair that was on his knuckles or the shape of his fingernails, and I was like,
sounds in the car, from the windshield wipers. It's the details that really bring you into the moment,
right.
And that she's able to connect her larger framework of the story for me. And it's pretty masterful. And in a year where we have some really powerful memoirs, I think it's really great.
Yeah.
The thing that strikes me also is how there's a way to write a really superficial memoir, and that's not what she's done. She's digging deep, and to dig deep, you have to say things that might be painful to the other people in your story. And how do you cope with that as a writer? How do you find the courage to dig deep in such a public way?
Yeah, I thought it was wonderful. Her stepmom and her aunt, who's a writer, Mona Simpson, everyone just kind of shrugged and said, well, you know what, that's her story and she's family and you do you, kind of. I'm paraphrasing, but I thought it was really wonderful that they could all see it for that. I think what we've all been saying about her owning the narrative, I mean, she would have told the same story if her father had been homeless in Palo Alto and not Steve Jobs. It's about the relationships.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the writing, because I want to talk about that. I thought it was really well written. You know, obviously she has writing in her life, with, like you mentioned, Mona Simpson. But I was surprised at how lyrical some moments were, on how literary it felt at some points, even just in the beginning. When she's talking about visiting her father when he was sick in the last 3 months of his life, that scene was just written really well, and I could have seen it in a piece of fiction or in anything written by a more like seasoned author. So I was really impressed by it, and it was performed well too in the narration.
And I just love this fact about her. She's really good friends with a short story writer who I really love, called, her name is Jamie Quattro. And so she's in this circle of writers already, and we do know that she is working on other projects, which she has said, thankfully, are not memoirs. I'm sure it takes a lot out of you to go there. So, but we do have more writing projects to look forward to from her.
And we know that authors are often seasoned a lot before they're published, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I heard what you said, Erin. You know, this book felt a lot like, where did this come from? You know, and all, as you know, and as we know from working with creators, people toil away in obscurity for a long time before fame comes knocking. So that's another satisfying piece of this.
And our frame of reference for her until now, if you even knew who she was, is just she's the daughter of Steve Jobs. You don't necessarily, so it's a nice surprise that she's here announcing herself by telling her story as I'm this force to be reckoned with and an amazing writer to boot.
And it's interesting, and when I first started listening to it, I had no idea that she was Steve Jobs' daughter. I just didn't put two and two together. And you almost forget that at many times during the story, because granted, it is her story. It's not the story of her life with Steve Jobs. It's her story, and he just happens to be tangentially related to her life. But it's so well written, and I think at times I kept forgetting. Like she does explain and kind of paint these pictures about scenes in her life that almost seem super mundane if you like remove all of the language that she uses, but it really keeps you vested in what in other words is just a story of her life. I mean, I'm not a huge memoir listener, so maybe that's why I think of it that way. But yeah, I mean, she made it very interesting when otherwise I might not have personally been as interested, just to be quite honest.
So Christina and I, when we started talking about this book, I think we both realized that we had strong personal connections to it. And for me, I grew up in a nuclear family, knowing my father really well, but it was a really complicated relationship, and there was at times a lot of love withheld. And so I really related to that aspect of seeing someone in your life who you know has the means to give you more, but chooses not to. And I also really relate to that feeling of being able to see from a high level that something's not quite right here, but still also feeling that pull of love because it's your family. So you can have that conflicting feeling of love and not love that exists simultaneously. And to me, that's what she captures in a way I never felt so seen in that way before, as it can be both. You can love and not love, or you can love and feel hurt at the same time. And I just found it so powerful and moving.
Conditional love is still love.
Yeah.
Discuss.
Yeah.
Yeah. Powerful.
And in her storytelling, we've talked a little bit about how it's literary, it's well written. This is a memoir that's not narrated by the author. It's narrated by a woman named Eileen Stevens, and it's wonderful. She brings this quality to the writing that it's like you're listening to someone their story gently unfolds.
And I was surprised, at first I was like, I only like to read memoirs, I only like to listen to memoirs narrated by the memoirist. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of went into it like, oh, bummer. But she does it so well that I've started to equate Eileen Stevens' voice with Lisa Brennan-Jobs. Yeah. And I assume if I were to meet Lisa Brennan-Jobs, she would sound just like Eileen Stevens.
Yeah.
And she modulates just perfectly when she's not mocking Steve Jobs when she's quoting him at all. She's not even attempting, I think, to sound like maybe what we think Steve Jobs sounds like. It's more like a father to a daughter.
Yeah.
Just a father to a daughter.
Yeah.
And I think she does such a virtuoso job at that. So.
Yeah. It's going to be a shock if any of us ever actually hear the real Lisa Brennan-Jobs speaking
That's
voice.
not what you sound like.
Yeah. Yeah. What did everyone else think of the narration? Because that's usually a hurdle for me as well. If it's a memoir, I'm like, I need it to be narrated by the author, and then I found myself totally swept away.
Yeah, I think that was Eileen's true skill here, was the fact that I think I told you I thought it was Lisa's narration, and she does such a good job of making it feel very personal. Mm-hmm. She's not reading a book, she's not narrating someone else's work. You feel like she's telling her own story, mm-hmm. and there are very few narrators who really are able to strike that tone where she's embodying this person. She's embodying her story in a way that feels, I know we like this word a lot, but it's authentic. It feels real, and that's worth its weight in gold.
Yeah. This year has been an incredible year for memoirs, especially for audio memoirs, and To be honest, I thought my favorite of the year was already wrapped up early on. There was just so many great memoirs that had come out. We're really seeing a hunger for personal stories where people are willing to take control of their own narrative. And this, I wasn't expecting to have this dethrone all of the other memoirs, and not that it has dethroned all of the other memoirs that I've listened to this year, but it definitely was a pleasant surprise to, this late in the year, find another memoir that stole my heart and rose to the top. And I don't think I have said yet, memoirs are my jam at Audible. I'm known as the memoir person. I write our memoir newsletter. I can be pretty picky about memoirs, and this just, it took the words out of my mouth. It took my breath away. It showed me new depths to memoir that I didn't even know existed. It's a really special memoir, and we hope you will enjoy it and that it will speak to you as much as it did for us.